It's my pleasure now to introduce you to Eric Ormsby. Eric Ormsby was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and has lived in London since 2005, where he's Senior Research Associate at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. Before that, he taught at McGill University in Montreal for 20 years, where he was Professor and Director of the Institute of Islamic Studies. He has published 7 poetry collections, most recently the lasciviously covered Baboons of Hada. I understand it is one of 2 Carcanet books published with a John Thomas on the cover in the last year, but it's the only one with a baboon's John Thomas on it, so worth the cover price just for that, I must add. He's also known as a provocative and fair-minded literary critic, and his reviews appear regularly in the New York Post, New Criterion, and TLS. It is difficult to classify Eric as a poet, for what stands out is an elegant mix of flamboyance and formal mastery. The world through his censors is carnal and spiritual at once. His masters are the Americans Wallace Stevens and Marianne Moore, yet his subject matter couldn't be more different. Unsavoury baboons and gawky flamingos, overbearing relatives, jinnis, caliphs, and resurrected biblical figures. About his poetry, John Updike wrote, "Ormsby's reverent attention to things as they are lights up every page with a glow." Please welcome Eric Ormsby.
Thank you very much, Evan, and I'd like to thank Poets and Players for inviting me here. It's a great honor. I'll start with a poem that I wrote some years ago about my mother. I went to visit her a year before her death. I mean, I visit her often, but I happened to be there a year before her death, and I noticed that all of a sudden she had become quite decorative as a person. I began to look at her almost as an artifact in her vivid clothes and her extravagant makeup. And I thought, well, you know, she's really quite beautiful, but almost like something carved and adorned. Of course, she was having none of this. My mother in old age. As my mother ages and becomes ever more fragile and precarious, her hands dwindle under her rings, and the freckled skin at her throat gathers in tender pleats like some startled fabric. The blue translucence of her veins gives the texture of her skin an agate gleam, and the dark blue, almost indigo capillaries of her cheeks and forehead resemble the gentle roots of cuttings of violets in sheltered jars. I love her now more urgently because there is an unfamiliar and relentless splendor in her face that terrifies me. "Oh, don't prettify decrepitude," she demands. "Don't lie. Don't make old age seem so ornamental." And yet, she abets her metamorphosis, invests herself in voluminous costume jewels and shrill polyesters, ambitious as a moth to mime the dangerous leaf on which she rests. For a long time, I was fascinated with different parts of the body, all of them, in fact. But this one I found interesting because it was about the fingernails. And I should mention there's one word in here that may not be familiar to you. This is the bird known as the Hoatzin, H-O-A-T-Z-I-N, which has vestigial claws on its wings in its youthful stage. Sorry, this sounds awfully pedantic. Fingernails. It is the patrimony of reptiles or of birds to possess such pale claws, to sport such little flashes of keratin at the farthest tip of the grasp. The baby Hoatzin has archaic claws along its barbarous wings that boost it into the Peruvian trees. So too are reminiscent hooks that let our fingertips negotiate the air and that curve around so obediently, like shields at rest, with all the snug patience of a carapace, snail's armature, or the fastidious hermit crab's limping pagoda of shell. The manicurist lovingly rebukes the creeping cuticle, so that the faint crescents, like clouds along horizons, reappear. The fingernails are suffused with the blood's sweet light, though the nails of the newly dead possess a terrible hailstone opacity. The fingernails palisade the unruly ranks of our willful fingers, and whenever we clasp our hands, a brief, convivial darkness sheathes our nails. Let me just read the title poem so you can see where that, actually the baboons in the poem are not at all priapic. If I can find the poem, that is. The Baboons of Hada. Hada, I should say, is a small place in Saudi Arabia, and when I was there as a consultant, we happened to pass this pinnacle where this family of baboons was seated and playing and frisking, and it caught my imagination. The Baboons of Hada. The baboons of Hada love the heights. High places let them contemplate the sordid valleys they have left behind. Along the scalded stones, blue lizards lie, flatten themselves or pump their beaded throats. But the baboons of Hada are aloof. The baboons know the indifference of peaks. Even their antics are deliberate. Their skipping over crags has stateliness. I like the way the baboons of the heights have colonized the coldest pinnacle, have softened and made stoical and sly the summits where 5 stringy crows still wheel, have humorized abysses, made crevasses comical, vaudevillioned the avalanche. Now the sweet sisters groom their brothers' braids, old aunties quaff the mustaches of nieces, their bright, fastidious molars crackle mites. And all the while, one Abrahamic ape, the dominant, the doji of his troop, hunkers heraldic on a lip of stone. His silvery, Hamitic sideburns fluff in the breezes of the heights. He shuts both eyes. The patriarch of Hada shuts his eyes, and all around is sibilance and gust. The scavenger baboons, consanguineous, plump down on their buttocks in the calm. A sense of fullness rises with the dusk. 5 crows still quarrel at contested scraps, but the lord of foragers is throned in peace amid the frisky chittering of his kids. The baboons wait until the rocks of heights become supernal in the full moon's light. At nightfall, the baboons of Hada sit in chuckling circles where they contemplate the radiant bottom of the risen moon. I was lucky enough to go on a trip to Antarctica some 10 years ago, and I was very fascinated as well as appalled by the penguins. I won't go into that. Nevertheless, I was also very moved to read about the emperor penguins, and as I'm sure you know, it is the male penguin who takes care of the chicks during the long Antarctic winter. So this is called the cradle song of the emperor penguins. Shackleton is stranded far to the north of us. The Endurance stands gripped in the fists of the ice. The skuas have withdrawn to the Cape. The leopard seals laze in the sun of the Weddell Sea. Our wives have trekked back to warm surf, having laid their eggs on our feet to brood hatch with our blood. Our empresses have left us to the long night of the ice. Like goalies, we cradle tense futures on our toes, dandling our babes against our belly skin. All winter we will stand in a pod of palaver against the winds of Erebus and shield our chicks under pouches of down and coverlets of quill. In the long night of the world, when the green krakens of the aurora writhe, we fast and hold our hunger to the wind. Our children hatch darkly. They hug our toes for life. My tufty chicks, my fuzz-downy bairns, I will guard you when the leopards of September return. I will shield you when the towers topple into the seas of ash. The soot of winter night is on my tongue. The cinders of ambushed dawn are on my eyes. Yet I will shelter you against my belly skin and warm your feather weakness with heart's blood and cradle you on the creches of my claws. I really have to give up smoking again. You know that dreadful experience of clearing a house out after someone you loved has died, whether it's your grandparents or your parents. And of course, it brings forcibly before us the whole feeling of transience. And this, for me, was embodied in an old broken pocket watch that had belonged to my grandfather, who was a railroad engineer. He drove a train through the state of Georgia. My grandfather's pocket watch. The filigreed watch case clicks open, and inside I find time's intimate machinery, the interlocking wheel's circumference, the pin-toothed sprockets that still coincide, even though the little self-important melody that marked the subdivisions of the hour is busted now and mute. Desolate of consequence, the pocket watch's innards look like our old diagrams of the Ptolemaic heavens with epicyclical and sweet-greased spheres, except that "Made in USA" appears, etched on a satiny spring, and George Evans and Son, New York, glints up from another. A second hand still whiskers the watch's face and staggers when I shake it in my fist. The dark dials mutter like two summer bees imprisoned in petals, and I feel them beat the ratchet of a rope let down into a well, breathless and staccato and discreet, each instant demarcated by a brittle click that falters and then halts until it's shook. The watch is dove and pearl and velveteen behind the dour digits of its face. Like hand-embroidered textiles or the stuffs William Morris designed, vine-tangled arabesques emblematic of luxuriance and rich tissues drawn from some profounder life. I twist the stem and listen for the tick till a tiny, startled, hurrying succession of twig-snapped seconds comes tip-tapping out. Each soft click is a comfort to my touch. My two sons, now grown men, were adopted when they were quite young, and they were each one was 6 weeks old. And I soon became quite annoyed by hearing people begin to sing praises to the blood. "They're not your blood," they would say. "Doesn't it bother you that they're not your blood?" And I began to conceive a kind of revulsion to the blood. But of course, that's ridiculous. You can't hate something so fundamental to your very being. And as I mulled it over, I can't seem to find the poem, though. Here it is. I realized that it was kind of a complex subject, to say the least. And this poem is called Blood, and it's from my two sons, Daniel and Charles. And it's written in a kind of rhyming couplets, but I deliberately use odd rhymes to suggest perhaps a nursery rhyme. All night in your ears, you'll hear the blood sing, "I am king, I am king, I am king." You'll hear the ganged hammers of the blood erect its palaces. You'll feel the sluices of the blood connect its empires. Blood with its royal rotten scent, in its rush-lit vestments, in its vehement arabesques, dangles its scarlet manacles or glows like radium inside sly ventricles. In stables where no savior lays his head, blood shows its Balkan, its Rwandan red. Blood is apodictic in its contradictions, cascades from Adam's heart, the crimson fictions of tribes and clans and families, knots the sinews with hot pieties. Children not of my blood, but of my love, whose sweet sonship is compounded of all that mutual breath could make of ours. We have plaited together what is ours, minute by minute. Consanguinity knows nothing of our fierce fragility. Blood relies hysterically on old school ties, while our enlacements all have been made thread by thread, braid upon braid. When lawyers with their starry writs and decrees of certiorari banter your nativity, haggling some clotted pedigree, say, blood should be slow, sound chuckle melodic in heart's bungalow, be the hearthstone brightened by rich hemagogues, the murmurous marrow of soft synagogues. Let the vessel's cantillations in your throat dulcimer the temple's pulsing note. For necklaces of ancestors twine love knots of time. Backward to Eden, let our recognitions rhyme. Thank you. Now, you all know the story from the New Testament of Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead after he'd been in the tomb for 3 days, and his sisters were standing around grief-stricken and mourning. When I began to write poetry again after a long period of not writing it in the early 1980s, I was fascinated by the figure of Lazarus, and I suppose in retrospect it had to do with my own rebirth in the sense that I was coming back to poetry after so long. And so I wrote a series of poems about Lazarus, and to me they seemed the first poems in which I found a way of expressing myself that was my own. This is called Lazarus and Basements. Lazarus had been a sluggish kid, fond of musky crevices where moles doze or where opossums paw their sour, disreputable nests. He loved that asylum of old clothes where moths webbed the spotted light bulbs, or the crawl cellar where the fat exterminator went on his monthly trips. At night, he saw spiders in his sleep, and dream itself furled outward in tough silk from the sly spinnerets of sleep. When he died, they planted him in a damp and mildewed hole. His basement nature had come home at last. Imagine our surprise, not at his wet, still bandaged face by the grave's low door, nor at the rank and vicious stink that smoked from his shroud, but at his loving familiarity with the damp and the companionable clasp of his arms brimming with vermin and all the gray caresses of his twittering friends. Now, we know Lazarus had sisters because we read in the Bible that they were very upset and distraught and begged Jesus to do something. But what's not said in the Bible is that there was a Mrs. Lazarus. And this is a somewhat lighter take on the story, but I tried to imagine how would she feel? Suddenly this guy is back again. You know, she's paid the caterer, she's, sat Shiva, and suddenly here he is. Mrs. Lazarus. Believe me, it isn't easy, even in a king-size bed, to sleep with the living dead. You think I can enjoy buttering his morning toast when the butter's not so cold as his gray ghost? And he's always so theatrical. Honey, what I've been through. I say, be a little stoical. You could be lying in that sleazy mausoleum. Instead, you're here with me. And let me tell you straight, it's no mean trick to stimulate a man like that, fresh from a grimy grave. He needs a paramedic just to shave. At night, his chilly skin sweats like a ripening cheese, and little bits keep dropping off till the poor guy's scared to sneeze. And the pills, the specialists, the life supports. There's even streptomycin in his shorts. I don't like the way he sits and squints or tilts off to one side in his lazy boy. Wouldn't you think he'd have a few small hints for the living? Instead, he whimpers, ah, or oi. Honey is all he says. It wasn't Vegas. All night I smell his interrupted death, It's my own individual hell. All night I hug his contagious carcass, dripping with verminous breath. I calm him as he dreams and squirms. I, who adore Chanel, now lie down with worms. I still have the dishes which my grandmother and great aunts painted when they were young women. It was a custom around the turn of the last century for women to have pieces of china that they would then decorate, usually with floral paintings. Hand-painted china. The slender cake plates had such fiery rims. They caught the lazy radiance of afternoons like torchlight from a tomb. The old roses opened to my eyes their bold, embellished centers where a soft darkness had been stippled in. They drew down my gaze until I felt labyrinthed in sweetness like a bee. My great aunts painted these. The hesitant brushstrokes on their undersides read 1893. The greenness of their china does not fade, but witnesses an opulence the more forlorn for being without issue. The pinks and gilts, the raveled petals, blousy with magenta, importune the fingers to partake of them. These were the gravy boats of plenteous expectation, the creamers rich with dream. These were the banquet platters, these the hard yet fragile saucers of trousseau. These were the festive dishes no one used. Now they snagged the curious light of afternoons in magisterial shadow like a pharaoh's mouth. Here, in the lovingly abrasive, gently gritted impasto of hand-painted surfaces that resist like skin with almost plush aplomb, I feel some embodiment of all their expectations had the right to claim. I feel their tentative fingertips touch mine. I'll end with one poem, again about my grandmother. I'm either writing about spiders or relatives. Sometimes they're not so different. This is The Crossing. My grandmother came from England, from London, to a utopian community in Tennessee named Rugby in 1881, and this is a poem about that. She saw the granite hills of Newfoundland. Icebergs impressed her with their hiddenness. A 12-year-old in pigtails, thin and plain, nursing her smarting knowledge by the iron rail of the great ship plowing west. Grandmother, life was still before you then. The year was 1881. Questions of birth and station already riddled you, but in the gray, fish-oily waters of the Grand Banks, you saw murres and gannets, birdlime mortised rock, and the way the tenant birds peered from their crevices, row upon row in rowdy harmony, like choristers arrayed for the grand chorale, seemed almost a parody of paradise, the disparate in unison, a public peace, the serried dovecotes of the raucous blessed, a world where everyone had found a place. As a child, I peeked into her diary of the crossing. Now it's lost. I popped the frail gilt lock and recognized the classic copperplate of her dead hand. A factual account spotting a pot of whales, the way the galley smelled, the look of the sun at sea. Prosaically, her every breakfast registered in neat detail. She had already learned to hide all that she felt. Her legacy was already handed down to us, as if it were precarious porcelain, worn ivory, the heirloom bauble of her secrecy. She shepherded her secrets into Tennessee, those hills of abnegation, those refusing fields, the bitter, immemorial drudgery. Rugby, Tennessee was one of those brutal utopias America loves, in winter chilblains and in summer dust. One day her father, a boilermaker's son from Westminster with gentlemanly longings, cut their new surname into the lower pane of a parlor window where I spotted it a century afterwards. Milmo, with Falstaffian swagger scratched into glass, as though it could not change or be effaced, as though it stood unalterable to slander or the scuff of time. And in January, in the stoveless pantry, every windowsill was rimmed with ice, like children's eyes with all their tears frozen inside them. When you surprised your mother in a still, despondent mood, her eyes so far away, you thought to say to her, "Maman, à quoi penses-tu?" knowing that if you spoke in mother French, she was likelier to reply. And Maman looked at you and gave a sigh. "À bien des choses, ma petite, à bien des choses." The question and reply a ritual, remembered into long old age. And evenings, as she wound her hair upon her head, I'd hear her whisper, "Notre Père qui est aux cieux." She enunciated each pure phrase until I felt the distant winter nights of Tennessee, the firelight of their voices, comfortable hubbub, the intertwine of anecdote and twig crumple, the whistle of the seethed sap between the pondered pauses of their voices, ceremonious, half whispering, a stately colloquy unremarkable except for cadences. People talk at night so musically to the firelight's sly accompaniment, and if I listened to her reminisce, the vanished voices of her sisters came to me again with all the soft, fiery pleasures of the hearth. I feel a tenderness of memory, grandmother, as though I heard your voice again and the great sea were both our memory now. And I will cross into your history, the way adopted children peek behind the secrets of their surnames to discern darkness after darkness of the past. And maybe it must always be just so whenever we touch the childhood of the dead. Thank you.